We're going to go to Luke chapter 15. Yep. We just pray that the force is with you this morning, that you may be awakened to all that's around you. Just kidding. I'll stop right there. I'm not going to go into Star Wars. I saw it. I am satisfied, and that's all I need to say. If you haven't seen it, I will pray for you after the service. So, okay. Yeah, spoiler, yeah. Here we go. Over the last 9 weeks, we've been talking about the message and stories of Jesus, the ones that he told. When you read the message and you listen to his stories with history and context, we actually hear it and understand it differently. And what we've seen over the last several weeks, or months really, is that Jesus speaks truth and life and meaning into the here and now. Not just to the back then or to there and then, but to right here and now. That God has something for us here and now. And I started this series, Real Jesus, really for my own sake. I said that I'm passionate about Jesus. I want to talk about Jesus because I want you to meet this Jesus. I want you to have an experience with the resurrected Messiah who lived in human history, died on the cross, and has been raised from the dead and is currently reigning. And so that's the point. What I love about Christianity is that God always looks like Jesus. That Jesus is the revelation of God. That at Christmas time we celebrate this great Greek word, or this Christian word called the incarnation. It's that the Christian story believes that God took on flesh and bone and moved into the neighborhood. He dwelled with us. And that's what John teaches, and that's what's quite significant about the Christian story. The Christian story is not about some rule that you have to follow or about some path. It's not about steps to getting somewhere. It's that God kept getting closer and closer to humanity to the point where he became flesh and bone. And then eventually he wants to dwell within us through the power of his Spirit. It's a beautiful thing. And if you pay attention to Jesus and you look at his life, what he reveals in his life message and his mission is a really good and beautiful God. And contrary to the views of Jesus' day and the common misperceptions of Jesus' time, people believed in the first century that to live in they believed that God was distant and far off and uninterested, or God was angry or full of judgment and wrath. And they believed that God was uninterested, and in order to move God, you had to perform and you had to have this conditional, you had to live in a certain way to be blessed by God, and that was conditional blessedness. So in order to earn favor with God, you had to be religious and legalistic and follow the rules. And that was the common perception of God during Jesus' time. But Jesus revealed a different kind of God in the scriptures. He revealed a different approach to life in this world here and now. And oftentimes we substitute the way that Jesus teaches us to live with religion, or our own distorted views of God, which we've talked about in the past. And when Jesus was confronted by the religious establishment during his time, he was questioned, mocked, and criticized about his approach to life, about his message, about what he was doing. He was criticized about the people he would spend time with because they were marked as sinners or tax collectors, the kinds of people that God wouldn't be hanging out with according to the religious establishment. So it made everyone frustrated and angry. And so what we have to know is that when Jesus teaches and when he talks about the kind of God that he knows, that he was in relationship with, he's offering people another way to interact in the world, but also another way to interact with God himself. And that's the point I want to make today, is that Jesus was motivated because of the relationship he had with God, because of the kind of God he knew, the kind of God he was and is. And so I want to talk about this morning. So this morning, I want to talk about a parable. So I have 3 things I'm going to do. I'm going to teach a parable with context. I'm going to share my observations about how to live a better story. So I want to talk to you about some observations I have from one parable about how you can live a better story today. And then I'm going to talk about why this particular parable is really important, why it matters to us this morning. You with me? So go to Luke No, really? Go to Luke. All right, Luke chapter 15, verse 11. It's a very familiar story. We're going to do part 1 of the story. And then we'll do part 2 next week. Bill will pick it up. Finally, Bill's back, thank God. He's been sick as well, and I've been teaching a lot. That's good. For some of you. I'm tired of teaching. No, I'm not. Okay, Luke 15:11. Jesus continued. There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the estate." So he divided the property between them. All right, I'm going to break up the story and then we'll tie it together at the end. But right away in the first century, with context, you would have been completely shocked by the intro to the story. It would have been completely shocking for 2 reasons. First, the oldest son is entitled to a double portion of inheritance. The youngest son, in this case, there are 2 sons, is only entitled to a third of all of the inheritance, yet in the language, the father splits it equally. So you're already off on the fact that the father is dividing the property, the estate, to the son equally. The second, if the son asked while the father was still alive for the inheritance, he's essentially disrespecting the father, and he deserves punishment, excommunication from the family, or even death, according to certain traditions. So he's essentially saying to his father, I wish you were dead. You're only good for the money you can provide for me when you were dead and gone. So right away in the first century, you would have been shocked. You would have been expecting some type of punishment. You would have been expecting to see something happen. But what's more shocking than the disrespect from the younger son, than the fact that he even asks this request, what's more shocking is that the father actually does it. The father would have to give up a piece of his land, which provided income. He would have to sell it off. And as a result of that disrespect, he would be dishonored by the surrounding community. He's dishonored by his son and rejected by his son. And he loses money and property in order to fulfill his son's wish of receiving inheritance early. 2 verses in context, you would have been shocked and outraged by the response of the younger son's request and the father's generosity and foolishness. Are you with me? Verse 13. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with pods that the pigs were eating. Listen to this. But no one gave him anything. This is the story of the prodigal son. The younger son now takes the inheritance, which wasn't rightfully his, squanders his money and inheritance in wild living. Loses everything. There's a famine that happens in the country, and he goes and hires himself out and goes to a field of pigs to feed pigs. Now, in context, this is what you would call rock bottom. Because Jewish people think that pigs are unclean animals. So you would never touch pigs or work with pigs or even use them, let alone feed the pigs. And what you have is a particular mindset that this young son has, which if you read the last verse of 16, it says, he longed to fill his stomach with the pig food, but no one gave him anything. His mindset is that he's a victim. He squandered his resources, the inheritance that was given to him by his father. And now he's used his life, his resources, his wealth, his very existence. He's at the very, very rock bottom of his life, but his mindset is still stuck as a victim. Do you know what I'm talking about? It's where many of us live this way, and if you've ever dealt with addiction, you know how hard it is to give help to people that struggle with addiction until they hit rock bottom. They have to get to a place where there's a shift in their mind. Because most of us do this as it is. We think life is happening to us. We are a victim to our own lives. That's our mindset. No one is giving me anything. That's our story, is it not? We become victims, and that's the mindset. He longed to fill his stomach. No one gave him anything. And we want something, but we're victims to our life. Who gave him an inheritance early? His father, but no one is giving him. So if you want to live a better story, you have to change your mindset. I want to give some advice as we head into the new year that you see in the story. We're going to talk about the implications of this story, but one of my observations about talking to people about transformation in life. How do you change? Are you busy, anxious, tired? Are you struggling with the same addictions and stress and sin? Are you struggling in the same relationship, the same patterns of frustration in your relationship with your spouse or fiance or whatever, your kids? The beginning of transformation begins with the recognition that if you want to live a good story, you have to change your mind. It starts with your mind. Are you with me? Okay. So it starts with a change of mind, a mindset shift. Now, because look at what happens at verse 17. Let's just look what happens. So first, no one would give him anything. Verse 17, when he came to his senses. So I take that as he's finally aware that he's now eating pig food in a far-off country with nothing to spare. It says, when he came to his senses, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am starving to death. He finally realizes he becomes aware of his condition. And he says, I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against you. I have sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. When he came to his senses, it says, so his mindset changed. If you want to live a better story, it's not just about changing your mind. If you want to live a better story, it's about making a plan. And this is where I just want to encourage you as you head into the new year. What do you want for the next season? Do you want to live a generous life? Do you want to have more community? Do you want to live outside of isolation and loneliness? Do you want to see transformation occur? You can't just think differently. You have to work your way into new behaviors. Make a plan. Make a plan. And so many of us get caught up and paralyzed about the plan, right? So we think of our step 4 and 5, but what's your number 1? What's the first thing that you need to do? For this guy, he just says, I need to go home. And then he starts working out how he's gonna work through his transformation and change, which I'll talk about in a second. But if you want to change, you got to make a plan. And I felt compelled to talk about that. I normally wouldn't make kind of these observations like this for life, but I just feel like so many of us are stuck in the same patterns, and we need to change. We need to break old mindsets and old behaviors. So we got to change our mind and we got to make a plan. So many of you don't have your finances together. Your step 1, what's your step 1? It's signing up for financial peace. You're struggling with the same sin and you want breakthrough this year. Tell someone about your sin. That's your number 1. Stop letting it have power in your secret life. The skeletons in your closet lose power as soon as you identify them and bring them out of the closet. You want to see radical change? Start with 1, not 4, 5, and 6. Okay? Make a plan today. Decide. My wife and I, it's been so busy. I have been tired and anxious, and I find myself going into these same habits, and for some reason we have a kid now, as you know. I don't know how that happened. I know exactly how that happened. We did a whole series on it, God Bless, Sex, Love, and God series. We have a kid, and we have a house, and we have more and more responsibilities. Our church is grown, and it's like as the older I get, the more responsibilities I see, and the more stressed out I get, the more anxious, the less I'm taking care of myself, the less I'm resting, the less I'm becoming the kind of person I really want to become. I've identified that recently, that I'm kind of a victim to life, and so my wife and I, for the last few weeks, we've just said, no, we're done. We're gonna change our mindset. We're gonna set a new plan. What's our number 1? Calendar. we just said, you know what, we're gonna be obedient to a calendar. We're gonna follow through with this calendar. We're gonna say no a lot more to a lot of requests of us hanging out. We're just gonna, because we want to be rooted, rested. We want to be a person of peace in a season of anxiety and chaos. That's what we want. So what was our number one? We had a business meeting to talk about our calendar. And it's been life-giving. So some of you, maybe it's get together with your spouse and have a business plan. Are you with me? Okay. Enough of the self-help for Darren. But there you go. Okay, if you want to live a better story, change your mind, make a plan. Here we go. Was that for someone? Can you just give me an amen if that's for you? Okay, you're welcome. Turn to somebody and say, that was good. I'm making a plan. Hey, okay. I'm going to start doing that. Younger son, this is what he says. This is his plan. Check it out. I'm going to go back to my father's house and become a hired servant. Servants in the first century worked on the estate and lived on the estate, and they were considered part of the family. A hired servant did not live on the estate. They lived in the surrounding village. They had a trade or some type of skill that they were paid for and earned a wage. They were not considered part of the family. He's saying, I'm not worthy to be part of the family. My plan is to go home and beg my dad for a job so that I could pay him back for what I took and I lost. In other words, he comes up with a strategy, a business plan, because he knew he had disgraced not just his family, but all the servants. Therefore, the entire community in the first century, including the servants in his father's household. And that meant he was dead to the family until he came back. And when rabbis talk about this, if you're part of a community and you offend the community, that apology is not enough to be brought back into community or family. You had to make restitution. You had to pay your way back for the wrong that you did, for the shame that you brought onto the father, the dishonor, the disrespect. He deserved death or punishment, and he took half of the estate. And so the rabbis taught he has to make restitution. And so that's what everyone's thinking. And so the son carries this mindset that the way he's going to go back and the way he's going to change is he's going to be hired as a servant. He's going to work off his debt. That's the right thing to do. That's the just thing for him to do. He's going to go home and earn his way back to his father. And so what does he do? Verse 19, he rehearses his speech. He says, I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. Listen to this. Can you just imagine? So the son's been far off. He's making his way home. And as he's going home, he's putting together his business plan, probably calculating how long it's going to take for him to pay back his father and give him back half of the estate, probably with interest. And the narrative he's telling himself, the story he's telling himself is, I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me a hired servant. Make me a hired servant. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. So he practices his lines. He's ready for his presentation. He's ready for a confrontation to bring this option to his father. And verse 20 is the heart of the Christian story. So he got up and went to his father, but while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him and kissed him. The son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father had said to his servants, quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For the son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and now he is found. And they began to celebrate. The father is crazy. While he was still far away, the father picks up his robe and takes off running to his son. In first century, men did not run. It was undignified. You'd have to bare your calves, like not wearing socks. You'd have to show your legs. You would never run. Girls would run, women would run, but never men, patriarchs of a family would never run in the first century. It was disgraceful. It was undignified for a father or a man of a household and estate to do this. The father takes off running and he confronts his son, and his son starts rolling out his business plan. He starts sharing the narrative he's living living in for all this time. And before he could get it out, the father interrupts him, wraps his arms around him, starts kissing his face, calls for sandals and robes and rings. And what does it have to do with? It has to do with restoration. It has to do with reconciliation. It's the identity that the son, living in rags, is now covered by the honor of his father. The father wraps his arms around his boy and says, welcome home. I'm not going to wait for you to pay off your debt. I'm not going to wait for you to work it off. You're not going to earn your way back into this family. I'm simply going to give it to you. I will cover your nakedness. I will cover your poverty. I will cover your rags with robes of glory. Let's kill the fattened calf. And in the first century, meals rarely had meat because it was so expensive. And if you ever had the fatted calf, that meant it was a celebration. That was a delicacy. That was a special opportunity. And it wasn't just for the family or the estate. It was for the entire village. And so you have a feast, celebration, food, dancing, drinking. It was a party recognizing that a son who was dead was alive. A son who was lost is found. And when we talk about Christianity, we have to talk about Christianity like this. Christianity is like a party. That's why we have to be the most joy-filled people in the world. We have to celebrate better than anyone else. We know there's a party going on. And some scholars say, when Jesus talks about the kingdom, he talks about it being like a party. That's what the Christian faith is like. It's like a giant celebration. And this celebration has to do with one sinner, one person returning home. And there's a party in heaven. When asked what our God is like, when asked by people at work, what's the Christian God like? We have to say, God is like a father that has two sons. And the younger son says, I hate you, Dad. I wish you were dead. Give me everything I deserve when you die. And the father gives him his inheritance. He squanders his inheritance, lives outrageous life, parties, drinks, loses the money, invests in the wrong things, does things that you should never do in the first place, gets to the point of life where he's troubled, he's lost, he's longing to just be by his father working for him. And he decides to himself, I'm going to go home, and in my shame and condemnation, I'm going to work my way back to the family. And as he heads home, his father, who every day sat looking, waiting for his son to round that corner. And as soon as he sees his son, the Christian God is like a father who takes off running towards his boy. And before an excuse, a business plan, all the earning that he could possibly do with his life, the father interrupts him with love, wraps his arms around his boy and says, welcome home. What is the Christian God like? He's kind of like that. Do you see how important this story is? Do you see how important this narrative is? Because if you worship any other kind of God, it is the wrong God. If this is not the God you've come to experience in your life, then you're worshiping an idol. Jesus is doing all sorts of stuff for us so that we can learn how to live here and now with a proper relationship with a loving God who kisses our face with compassion and says, welcome home. Do you know this God? This relentlessly pursuing God. This is the heart of the Christian story. This is the heart of the Christian message. Another observation, and this is what really got me this week as I was prepping. If you want to live a better story today, make sure you're telling the right story. If you want to live a better story, make sure you're telling the right story. We all carry a version of our own stories around, don't we? We carry this narrative of who we are. The younger son believed he was no longer worthy. Think about this. The younger son believed he was no longer worthy of being his father's boy. That's the story he told himself over and over and over again. That's the story he was living in when he hit rock bottom. That he was walking home thinking, I'm not worthy of being my father's son. His story was one of shame and condemnation and one of failure, not measuring up, not being good enough. His story was one of having to earn his way back, having to work the debt off, having to walk a painful road back to reconciliation. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me a servant, he said. How many of us are telling that story? How many of you have come to the Christian faith believing you're still not worthy? You're not good enough. You're not lovable. You have to earn it. You have to prove it. You have to show more and more and give more and more because you have to work your way to receive your belovedness. How many of you are living in that? But see, this is what's so profound with the parable. The son gets home only to discover that the father had a different version of the story. You see, his father tells the story of a return. The father tells a story of restoration. The father's story while his son was far away was, my son is dead. My son is lost. But when he sees his boy, the story is he's found, he's alive. It's you're back home. It's a different story. It's a story of reconciliation, of forgiveness, of grace, of love, of a debt being paid, of freedom. It's a story of true identity. In order for the son to actually change, to experience real transformation, and he has to not only return home and change his mindset and make a plan, but he has to decide to live in the better story. He has to tell the right version of his story. Do you see how profound this is? Because he's home and he could say, no, I'm going to pay off my debt. I'm going to earn my way to be your son. All the while, God just saying, you already have it. You don't have to do anything, just receive it. There's nothing you can do. It's all based on who I am as the father that enables you to be my son or daughter. And many of us know that in the life of transformation, in the process of seeing transformation, this is the hardest part of the story. This is the hardest part of our life. The hardest part is to accept what is ultimately true about ourselves and learn to own our story. Are you with me? Make sure you're telling the right story. You see, the heart of Christianity, there's this word, and it's so profound. And we say it in Christian circles, but we don't have the foggiest idea of what it means. It's called grace. And the word grace isn't fair. And that's the essence of the Father. You see, the Father sees a younger brother who returns as one more occasion to practice his unfairness. The younger son doesn't deserve a party, and that's the point of the party. That's how grace works in the Father's world. Profound unfairness. Christianity is so unfair because people get what they don't deserve. Parties are thrown for younger brothers who squander their inheritance. This is the story you have to come and accept and live in. It's too good to be true, and that's what grace is. God enabling you to do what you could never do on your own accord or strength. And if you fail to accept this word or this story, this narrative of God, grace, you'll fail to understand the God that Jesus reveals. Merry Christmas. I'm not done. This is my story, and this is why I share it with you. Because I'm a prodigal. When I was 17, I was so hurt by family relationships that I became angry and resentful towards God. I hated what I didn't understand, and that led me towards a life of freedom where I went to school, I went to college for the first time, and I drank lots of alcohol. I covered my pain with crowds and parties. I hid my anger with a pleasant, optimistic smile. I was so depressed and resentful and sad. I scheduled my life around the parties. I convinced dozens of people, half a dozen people, or so, to leave their Christian faith because I was so angry. I did the meanest things, trying to convince Christians to walk away from what I thought was just wives' tales. And then I was confronted by grace at a party. I was drinking, probably drunk, 17 years old, completely lost in Isla Vista in Santa Barbara. And a young girl comes up to me, and I'm drinking in public, and she says, "Turn your cup upside down. There's police over there. If they see you drinking, you'll get a ticket or arrested for being a minor in possession, drinking in public." And she was a Christian. It was a Christian house thing going on. And she didn't confront me. She didn't condemn me. She didn't reject me. She showed me kindness. And in an instant, I heard at the center of my being and in my mind this invitation, which was posed as a question. What are you doing? And I knew instantly that it was God. I dropped the beer. I dropped the free cheeseburger that they gave me. I ran back to my dorm, which for a poor college student, that was a big deal. And I ran home. I ran to my apartment, and I rededicated my life to Jesus, my whole life back to Jesus. And I was so confronted in my heart and my soul and my being with this understanding that God loved me. I wept and I wept and I wept, and then I became depressed, and I left school because I felt so much guilt and shame about who I was and what I did. And although I gave my life to Jesus that day, I didn't know who God really was. Because the journey for me to experience grace took a long time, because what I did is I took all that shame, all that pain of causing people to doubt their faith, all the pain of drinking and not being a quote-unquote witness to people, I collected those records, and I thought, in order for me to work this, or order for me to be a good Christian, I have to work it off. I have to prove that I was worth saving. And so I carried that I'm not worthy to be called your son everywhere I went. I went to Rock Harbor. I went to college. I served the homeless. I started a Bible study. I volunteered in the youth group. I wrote youth group curriculum. I went to church on Sundays and Wednesdays. I went to Huntington Beach trying to convince people that if they died, they were going to hell. I did all sorts of things because deep inside, I felt I was not worthy of sonship. Until, over time, I was confronted with the better story. And that's the word grace. That I had another encounter with God's grace. And it seems like every time I open up my life to Jesus, every time I'm confronted with God's presence in worship, every time I surrender myself and say, God, you're welcome here. You know what he says to me over and over and over and over again? I love you. I'm so proud of you. I'm so pleased with you. You guys, brothers and sisters, the narrative you have to hear is the story that God has been speaking from the beginning of time. He longs to walk in right relationship with you. He's proud of you. He's pleased with you because to him, you're just a son and daughter he's waiting to love on. Are you with me? This story is so important because it's my story. God's love has nothing to do with the son's speech. It has everything to do with his actions. If you want to live a better story, you got to learn to own this story, own your story, own all of your story. I see now that the story of the prodigal son is not a story about a son leaving. It's a story about a son returning home. The prodigal son is not the story about a son leaving. It's a story of a son returning home. And so why does this story matter so much? Well, this is what God is like, period. So if you're new to this Christian journey, this is what God is like. He has a love that will pardon and restore every kind of brokenness and sin that you can ever imagine. And it has nothing to do with what you can do. It has everything to do with who he is. God's love shapes everything else around us, and it's how we interact in the world. It's how we learn to work in this world. It's how we learn to interact in this society and culture around us with people. And the Christian story is about a God that has been pursuing you since you were born. And he is the kind of God that wants to come after you. And he welcomes you back before you have your speech together, before you have your act together, before you get your life together, before you can do anything to clean up the mess you've made with your life and addictions, before you have your doubts answered. He's the kind of God that just says, you're welcome home. You're my boy and you're my girl. Amen? So I thought, what a great way to enter into Christmas. Remembering the heart and message of Jesus, because this is what he came to reveal. This is whom he came to reveal, a God who is relentlessly pursuing you. I want to invite you to live a better story. Change your mind, make a plan, tell the right version of the story and own it. But most importantly, receive the Father's love for you this morning. Amen?